guards crashed into the chamber, and the High Initiate shoved a smoldering sigil into a stitched pocket before he could be seized. Suspicion drove the researcher forward from the shadows. Suspicion that the city's claim of civic order hid something corrosive. The magistrate barked orders. A guard's metallic gauntlet struck the altar rim. The researcher counted heartbeats and watched the initiate's hands, noting the way fingers trembled over a dagger. Within those first seconds, the problem was plain. Civic order and the cult's doctrine were colliding in a way that would not stop at arrests. The researcher stepped from behind a collapsed pillar with a thin, deliberate breath and pocketed a torn manuscript page lifted from the altar when the guards forced the High Initiate to the floor. He kept his voice low as he moved. "Stand down." The magistrate snapped. "Silas, search them." The researcher did not speak. He replaced the page under his robe and let confusion spread through the room as shields crowded the relics. That page contained a clear line. "Order is a mask for tyranny." The researcher felt urgency replace suspicion. Urgency made him step from observer into actor. They dragged the High Initiate to his feet. The High Initiate's amber eyes fixed briefly on the researcher. He murmured a single phrase under his breath and held the dagger in a way that asked permission, rather than threatened violence. The researcher watched the scarred jaw, the inked sigils at wrist, the braided hair tangled with dust. The magistrate, "You will answer for this before dawn." The researcher realized the stakes. This was not merely suppression of rights. It was a politicized purge aimed at consolidating visible conformity. Outside in the alleys, the initiate fled between wet stone walls while guards' torches ate at the dark. The researcher followed at a measured distance. A guard ran a hand along the alley lip, searching for footprints. The researcher ducked behind a cart and watched the initiate vault a low wall and disappear through a narrow passage. The researcher moved in and retrieved the altar scrap he slipped into his coat when the melee began. He opened it with gloved fingers. The script was cramped and deliberate. A marginal note had been added in a different hand. "Order keeps rulers safe. We must unmake their safety." The discovery felt specific and dangerous. Doubt shifted into determination. The researcher met the initiate in a cramped safe house before dawn. A single candle burned low over a patched table. The initiate's breath was quick and wet with fear. "You took the page." The initiate, "You don't belong here." The researcher replied, steady. The initiate moved his hands in ritual signs while he spoke. He performed a small paradox ritual, rubbing two iron rings together, and then setting one aside to reveal an inscription only visible when the other was absent. The researcher leaned forward, fingers tracing the letters without touching. The initiate's voice dropped into a practiced litany. "Disorder strips the mask," he said. The researcher direct questions. "Why destabilize? Who benefits?" The initiate answered with a measured cadence. "Citizens who accept order give rulers their right to rule. We undo that grant." The researcher felt a new emotion. Wary respect. He recorded the litany in his journal, the leather rubbing faintly against the table. An elder scribe arrived with a marginal note in hand. He moved stiffly, eyes flicking to the initiate, and then to the researcher, read this aloud. The researcher. The scribe read the contested note. His voice cracked on one line, and then steadied. "It names a pact between the council and a merchant guild to enforce ritual prohibition in exchange for policing rights." The researcher watched the scribe's fingers tremble. The scribe folded his hands. "This was hidden in a ledger binding my name to a payment schedule," he said. The scribe's confession shifted the emotional field again. Wary respect gave way to alarm. The researcher and the initiate exchanged a quick, wordless glance. They had moved from academic curiosity to the edge of danger. At the municipal archive, the researcher tried to corroborate the ledger. The magistrate met him in the reading room with a folded complaint. "You have no standing." The magistrate, voice tight, "Your presence endangers the city." The researcher placed the torn page on the table. "This marginal note contradicts council records," he said. The magistrate leaned forward. "You will hand over that page," the magistrate demanded. A clerk, young acolyte by name, had been arrested in the stack while looking at forbidden diagrams. The researcher watched the acolyte cuffed and distraught as the magistrate's guards moved to seal the room. The researcher felt betrayal flare. Betrayal at a system that punished inquiry. In the archive backroom, the researcher worked through a midday that smelled of dust and old glue. He and the elder scribe sat close under a low lamp. The scribe unrolled a hidden folio and pointed to a ledger entry dated a decade earlier. Here, the scribe, tapping with a rusted stylus, counsel payments for enforcement. The researcher tapped the page with a fingernail and felt the grain of old paper. Who signed this? The researcher. The scribe swallowed. Your magistrate signed on behalf of the council. The scribe. The researcher felt anger harden his jaw. So the magistrate bought policing rights with hidden funds, he said. The scribe nodded and added, they called it civic consolidation. The researcher closed his eyes briefly and then opened them. He had moved from scholar to conspirator, and the choice had weight. The high initiate staged a provocation in Market Square when the magistrate announced a public ritual ban. He tossed a cluster of ash sigils onto the marketplace steps and shouted a short proclamation that accused the magistrate of buying obedience. The crowd reacted, that was the point. A guard shoved a vendor. The vendor retaliated by overturning a stall. The researcher watched as a guard struck a man who had shouted at the magistrate. The crowd's mood altered. Murmurs turned to jeers. The high initiate stepped back and let the city's disorder surface. The researcher heard a woman shout, "He lied." The magistrate's face tightened. The researcher felt the crowds shift into collective anger. A new emotional turn. Solidarity flickered in faces that had been indifferent earlier. A sudden sweep followed. After the market-esque commotion, the guards moved fast. The high initiate was captured in a narrow lane as he tried to slip back among supporters. The researcher reached the holding cell later under cover of night. He found the initiate bound to a post, his braided hair falling loose, eyes bright with a controlled flame. The magistrate stood before him and tossed a coarse cloth onto the table. "You endanger the city, the magistrate. You would set citizens against law." The initiate answered plainly, "I unmask what the city hides," he said. The researcher took in the scene. The initiate's ritual scarification against the lantern light, the magistrate's signet ring catching firelight, the guards shifting uneasily. The interrogation turned rapid and pointed. "Why use disorder?" the magistrate demanded. The initiate met his gaze. "Order bends men to fear." The initiate replied, "Order covers theft of rights." The magistrate slammed the table. "You seek to topple governance," he said. The initiate leaned forward, voice low. "Governance rests on consent." "We remove forged consent," the magistrate spat. "You will be removed." The researcher moved closer and asked, "Who profits from your removal?" The magistrate's jaw tightened. His answer was not a refutation, but an admission. "Those who stand to lose power when citizens question them." The researcher recorded the magistrate's words in shorthand. The interrogation produced the chapter's pivot. The magistrate admitted a planned purge. Betrayal swelled in the researcher's chest. He had suspected collusion, now he had confession. The researcher pressed the high initiate more. "Who gave you this directive?" he asked. The initiate cuffed and spat blood into a basin. He licked his lips and named names with ritual economy, not a single office, the initiate a network. Merchants, counselors, men who signed ledgers. They feared our rights because rights taught refusal. The researcher felt incredulity tilt into grim clarity. The scribe's ledger matched the initiate's list. The researcher looked at the magistrate. "You signed the ledger," he said. The magistrate's face went gray. "I signed to keep the peace." The magistrate snapped. "You call it peace. We call it order." The researcher heard the word order repeated until it sounded like a door slamming shut. Under pressure, the initiate revealed a tactic. They engineered measured disorder to expose abuses. He described a staged act that provoked a guard into beating an innocent vendor, then used that beating to show the crowd the magistrate's brutality. We do not want chaos. The initiate, we want exposure and choice. The magistrate scoffed. You manufacture harm to win sympathy. The researcher felt an ethical friction. Had the initiate's actions crossed a line? He looked at the initiate's hands and saw they shook. The initiate, we choose targets like a surgeon selects tissue to cut away infection. The researcher recorded the line and then demanded, who ordered a purge? The magistrate hesitated and then named a meeting date that matched entries in the ledger. The researcher realized he had both motive and means. The interrogation escalated into a fast exchange. Magistrate, did you authorize arrests? The researcher, yes. The magistrate replied, why? The researcher pressed, to prevent unrest from contagious rumors. The magistrate, that is false. The initiate snapped. You called rumors contagious when you meant dangerous to your profits. The researcher counted the back and forth lines as evidence. The chorus of voices, initiate, magistrate, researcher, created a chain of claims that exposed the magistrate's intent. The emotional shift moved from betrayal to urgency. The researcher knew a single decision could decide lives. A sudden commotion outside fractured the chamber. Shouting in the courtyard, a scuffle on the stairs. The magistrate barked for order and 2 guards rushed from the room. The researcher seized that micro break. He exchanged a look with the elder scribe, who had slipped in through a back door. We must move the fragment now, the scribe whispered. The researcher slipped a small folio out of his coat. The scribe replaced it with a blank cover and nodded. This event, an external interruption, propelled them into action. The researcher felt resolve harden into plan. They met in a hidden cellar that night, 3 of them. The researcher, the elder scribe, and the freed young acolyte who had been released on a technicality. The room smelled of damp stone and ink. The acolyte's hands shook as he fed a strip of parchment into a lantern's light. This fragment proves the ledger referenced a purge, the acolyte. It ties the magistrate to merchants. The researcher held the fragment and felt the raised ink under his thumb. We can use this to delay enforcement. The researcher. The scribe mapped a route through the archive to a private study. We go tonight. The scribe. The researcher nodded. The emotional movement now tracked from urgency to determination. They decided to act rather than wait. They moved under the small hours. The researcher led the march with a borrowed cloak, keeping to stone shadows and service alleys. The elder scribe carried lantern light tucked low to avoid attention. The acolyte slipped ahead and listened at doors. At a corridor juncture, the researcher paused and told them, "Stay close." The acolyte replied, "We follow, researcher." The researcher felt the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. He kept his steps measured so the acolyte could match them. The group reached the magistrate's private study and found the door bolted. The scribe set a small hand drill to the lock and worked with steady strokes. External action again, a lock yielding under tools. Inside the study, the air held the sharpness of tobacco and old ink. The magistrate's desk sat centered, a brass lamp unlit. The researcher produced a reproduced sigil he had drawn earlier from the initiate's rituals. He unfolded a sheet matching the manuscript and placed it on the desk so the ink face up would catch the lamp's glow. He set a small portion of ash on the sigil and watched it burn. The researcher left the fragment folded in his coat for safekeeping. He arranged the room so nothing else was disturbed. The scribe whispered, "This will make them search this desk for answers they cannot find." The researcher felt a final shift. From investigator to provocateur with a precise aim rather than reckless interference. Before dawn, the researcher stepped back and watched the ash dissolve into a faint, curling smoke that pooled along the edge of the desk. He left one more thing. The reproduced sigil set to smolder where the magistrate would find it, and the folded fragment hidden in his coat. The researcher felt the residuum of the night's choices as a physical pressure behind his ribs. He locked the study door from the outside with the same small tool the scribe had used and moved away through a narrow service passage. When he emerged into the pale morning, a street vendor poured water over a brazier. A child kicked a pebble. The city continued. Nothing had changed outwardly, but within the ledger and the archive, the balance had been altered. The researcher returned to the safe house and handed the fragment to the scribe. "Hide this in the ledger with your hand." The researcher. The scribe took it and tucked it into a hollowed folio. The researcher watched him work and felt a cold certainty that their action would delay arrests and force a public inquiry. He also knew their act would make enemies. The high initiate remained in custody. The researcher had not freed him. That choice weighed on him. The researcher felt a steady guilt and a professional resolve in the same pulse. At dawn, the magistrate discovered the smoldering sigil on his desk. He banged his fist and swore. Guards fanned out. The magistrate read the reproduction and found the tucked ledger fragment on a shelf where the scribe had hidden it earlier in a ploy to control discovery. The researcher watched the city pages begin to turn. The magistrate convened an emergency council. The researcher slipped away into the crowd with the scribe's note folded tight against his chest, and the memory of the initiate's scarred hands burned into his mind. Before the chapter closed, the researcher returned once more to the magistrate's study. He placed a final precise reproduction of the symbol on the desk and let a single grain of ash fall into the inner drawer. He did this as a quiet reminder that enforced order could not fully contain the currents beneath it. Then he left. As he stepped into the street, he felt the immediate pressure of being watched. Someone had seen him pass the alley. He did not pause. He folded his collar against a chill and walked away, carrying the knowledge that the city now faced a choice made visible by a small, stolen fragment and a smoldering sigil. Guards shoved the high initiate through the tall doors, and the magistrate barked, "Bring him forward." The occult researcher caught a folded scrap as it fell from the initiate's sleeve and tasted iron on his tongue. Emotion root suspicion. Suspicion had already driven him from the ruined chamber where, weeks before, guards had crashed into the hideout and the high initiate had shoved a smoldering sigil into a stitched pocket to hide it. The chamber memory tightened the researcher's hands. He stood in the gallery and unfolded the torn manuscript page, while the crowd pressed, like a tide below. The manuscript named offices and names, civic printers, tax registers, the magistrate's own clerk, as instruments used to impose a uniform piece the sect called fabricated law. The researcher scanned the jagged ink and felt resolve first through his jaw, then a thin, cautious hope. He remembered the guard's metallic gauntlet from the previous crash. That image pushed him forward. The central conflict was immediate: reveal the accusation and destabilize the city, or keep the evidence secret and preserve the researcher's cover. The magistrate slammed his staff on the dais. "High initiate, answer." The high initiate stood, hands bound, robes threaded with patched textiles. "Why attack our peace?" The magistrate demanded. "Magistrate." The researcher mouthed under his breath and folded the page to hide the smudged sigil. Tension rose as the guard captain stepped up. "Captain, produce the charges." The magistrate snapped. The scribe leaned forward with a quill poised. The researcher slid the manuscript into his coat and moved his fingers to the leather-bound journal at his hip. He had to decide in that moment whether to draw attention. His hesitation was a physical thing, sweat on his palm, breath pinched, spectacles fogging. "High initiate." The magistrate louder. "You defy the city." "What do you confess?" The initiate answered in a low, liturgical voice. "The city confesses through its servants," he said. "The city wears law like a crown of plates. It denies the rot beneath." The gallery stirred. A woman in a wool cloak hissed the word "sedition." The researcher kept his gaze fixed on the inked lines in the manuscript and felt a tremor he chose to call calculation. He needed confirmation, not spectacle. After the interrogation tightened into performance, The magistrate leaned toward the guard captain. Search his person. Find anything seditious. The guard captain nodded and 3 men reached the initiate. One hand brushed the stitched pocket. One guard froze while she withdrew a smoldering scrap of ash and fabric and slapped it onto the dais. The magistrate raised a hand to silence the outcry. This council will not be undermined, he declared. The researcher made his move when the scribe bent to copy the exchange. He slipped from the gallery, down a narrow stair, and into an archway where sunlight failed to reach. The manuscript page burned cold against his palm. He thought of the ruined chamber where the high initiate had stuffed the sigil into a pocket as guards crashed in. That earlier moment had left a single decisive question lodged in the researcher's mind. Whose order was being enforced, and by what instruments? He followed the hallway to the holding cells. In the first holding cell, the researcher found the initiate seated on a low stone bench, wrists raw from cords. He crouched and set the leather-bound journal on his knee. I have the page. The researcher. Show me where it came from. The initiate met him with slow breathing and tilted amber eyes. You have courage, the initiate, or a foolish curiosity? Researcher, occult researcher, he corrected. Researcher. The initiate repeated and smiled without mirth. The initiate slid a hand beneath the robe and handed over a small, rusted dagger with a notched handle. Take this, he said. The dagger opens doors we cannot force. The researcher turned it over. Dried resin clung to the blade and old iron flecks showed along the tang. He accepted it with fingers that did not tremble outwardly. Where did the manuscript come from? The initiate tapped his temple, and then his wrist where inked sigils had once been visible. From mouths and ledgers, the initiate answered. From the ledger that records orders given as if they were neutral facts. They bind people with signatures. The researcher slid the dagger's hilt into his coat, and felt another emotion arrive, a cautious alliance manifesting as a steadying breath. At the civic plaza, the magistrate issued a proclamation. We will confiscate suspect texts and cleanse our records, he told the gathered crowd. The crowd muttered. The guard captain moved through them with a column of men. The researcher watched from a shadowed arch and counted faces in the crowd. Some eyes were curious, others plainly afraid. A boy spit on the ground when the magistrate's herald spoke. The researcher realized that public punishment would fragment rumor into panic, that calculation forced his next choice. As the magistrate's men gathered suspect books, an acolyte slipped through the cordon toward the western alley. The researcher intercepted her hands as she turned the corner and took a sealed note from within her sleeve. The note was folded tight and bore a spiral sigil on wax. The acolyte's eyes darted acolyte, the researcher, and she answered, acolyte, with equal sharpness. She touched his arm and whispered, this will show how they file commands. She stepped back then, raising a hand in a practiced diversion. And a clash erupted in the plaza as 3 boys started a fight. The diversion worked. The high initiate slipped a loose knot from his bonds and was led away in the scuffle. The researcher unbrokenly unfolded the wax and read the ledger's address, an underground municipal archive beneath the hall. He felt a shift from suspicion to purpose. His hand steadied. He and the initiate moved toward the archive through service corridors, smelling of dust and old glue. The municipal archive's stacks were narrow and pressed with hushed paper. Lamps guttered. The researcher and the initiate moved between shelves and found where the ledger should have been shelved under a civic clerk's name. The label was gone. The researcher pulled loose a latch and a shelf swung to reveal a hidden recess. Inside lay a ledger with leather frayed at its corners. He touched the cover and felt the impression of seal wax. This is it, the initiate. This ledger records delegated orders, who made them and who enforced them. The researcher opened to entries and scanned names of magistrates and dates of edicts, recorded as administrative notes. The handwriting listed punishments, quotas, and clauses that ordered sanitation or harm reduction, but paired them with private lines. Apply pressure to dissenters and certify removals. Footsteps thundered. Stop them. A voice shouted. The guard captain had traced the pair to the archives. The researcher shoved the ledger into his coat and pushed the initiate toward a narrow stair. The guard captain was already halfway down the stair with 2 men behind him. Guard captain, the researcher aloud, and the guard captain barked, "You there, hold!" The stair became a point of contact. A short scuffle began where leather struck leather, and the initiate flung his shoulder into a door. Magistrate, the guard captain called up the stair. They were in the archive. The magistrate's voice answered faintly from the hall above. Seize the ledger. The researcher ducked into an alcove and pressed the ledger against his chest. He felt panic, an animal tightening in his throat, and then a decision that pushed him out. He would not hand this record back to men who used records as instruments of control. He bolted past the guard captain and ran headlong into the archive stacks, knocking over a small lamp. Oil hissed on flagstone. The lamp's hiss attracted several men, and the scribe appeared at the stair with a torch. Scribe, the researcher, and the scribe's eyes flicked to the ledger exposed beneath the researcher's arm. The scribe raised the torch to read a line aloud. Entry April 5. Compile household lists. Mark agitators for re-education. The scribe froze, then lowered the torch. His face showed confusion that edged into alarm. The researcher could see the scribe measuring risk. Scribe, the researcher in a softer voice, read the name at the header. The scribe's hand shook and he read a name that tied the order to the magistrate's own clerk. An altered recognition crossed the scribe's face. Magistrate's hand, he said. The guard captain's jaw clenched, and he moved to reach the researcher. Guard captain, the researcher, and the guard captain lunged with a short, sharp strike. The researcher sidestepped and pushed the initiate toward a stack, where the initiate performed a ritual gesture that made a small trapdoor yield beneath a pile of rolled parchments. The initiate pushed the researcher down into a narrow service tunnel while the guard captain and men fought to clear the stacks. In the tunnel, the researcher and initiate paused to breathe. Dust filled the air and scraped at their throats. The initiate fumbled with a strip of cloth and produced a map fragment and a small slip of handwriting. An index of civic departments and folding signatories. This map, the initiate, shows how they wrote enforcement through petty offices. They call it order. It is collection and pressure. The researcher read the entries aloud and felt a new emotion. Dread given shape by evidence. He tested the paper for tamper marks and felt cold iron where hidden pins had held it closed. They emerged behind the ceremonial dais as night fell and torches guttered low. The magistrate had gathered a small army of men and positioned the ceremonial crown on a raised plinth like a symbol to be defended. The crowd had reassembled under torchlight with anger and confusion clear on faces. The magistrate spoke of law and purity. Magistrate, a voice in the crowd echoed, and a scuffle broke out near the steps. The researcher saw the acolyte slip among the watchers and point at a page she held open. Faces looked down and a murmur moved through the crowd. The high initiate stepped onto the dais, wrists still bound, and when a guard raised a hand to restrain him, the initiate began a short, rhythmic litany. He spoke in snatches so listeners could catch phrases. "We do not reject order for chaos," he said. "We reject enforced sameness. We reject a ledger that hides commands." The magistrate moved forward to interrupt. The high initiate used the motion to knock his shoulder into the crown stand. A bronze filigree snapped. A shard of gilding clattered to the floor like a small accusation. The crown toppled and hit the stone with a ringing crack that silenced the hall. The researcher saw the ledger slide free from his coat, where a seam had split during the run. It lay exposed on the dais, open to a page that showed the magistrate's clerk's seal next to a directive for public order maintenance. Shouts rose. The guard captain lunged for the ledger. The initiate planted his feet, and recited another line while the acolyte shoved a bundle of false papers into a guard's face to buy seconds. That moment became the chapter's peak. Men collided, robes tore, and several crowd members rushed the dais. The magistrate seized for the initiate's psalm, and the guard captain reached for the ledger. The researcher had seconds to act. He stepped into the surge and took the ledger with both hands, yanking it back from the guard captain's grip. "Magistrate," he said, voice steady though his heart hammered. "Read this aloud." The scribe grabbed the ledger and read a single paragraph that listed names and instructions for coercive measures. The crowd reacted with a sound between cry and shout. The magistrate's face went white, and then hard. "This is forgery!" he cried. "This is false!" The guard captain pressed forward, and the researcher heard the rasp of leather straps. The high initiate drew a small knife and used it to cut the cords binding his wrists. He moved at a deliberate, ritual gait and struck the crown stand again, shattering the remaining filigree. The crowd surged into two currents: those who wanted to protect the magistrate, and those who wanted to read the ledger. 3 rapid exchanges followed between the magistrate, the guard captain, and the initiate. "Give it here." The guard captain barked. "Magistrate, take control," he urged. "No." The initiate, "No more papers to hide the cost of peace." The researcher answered with one line. Read the names. That line changed everything. People craned to see the ledger's entries, and the scribe read more lines aloud until the magistrate's denials sounded splintered beside the names that the public now heard. The confrontation became violent. Men shoved and struck. A torch fell into a pile of oil, cloth, and flared. The researcher felt heat lick his face and smelled burning hemp. He pushed the ledger beneath his coat and forced a path through the press of bodies to a scholar's room above the hall that he had used before. The initiate stayed behind to draw attention. The acolyte created another diversion by shouting a single name that meant nothing to most but triggered a small cadre of followers who cut the magistrate's path. In the immediate silence after the clash, the researcher sat on a narrow cot and tore out a page of the ledger to place in a shallow box. His hands were black with ink and soot. He catalogued the page with careful strokes and labeled it by clerk name and date. He felt exhaustion press into his shoulders and an ache behind his eyes. He also felt an emotion that had arrived slow and heavy, solitude mixed with responsibility. He had chosen action and could not return to neutral observation. 2 knocks came at the scholar's door. The researcher opened it to find the acolyte with a damp cloak and a smear of ash on her cheek. "Acolyte," he said, "you risked much." She shrugged and answered, "We risk much more every day." She handed him a small sealed packet with a list of names the cult had compiled over years of oral rites and civic observation. "This will help you link names to signatures," she said. The researcher thanked her without using the word and slid the packet into the same box with the ledger fragment. A messenger's footfall echoed in the stair below. Distant voices swore that the magistrate had ordered arrests and purges. The researcher listened and then closed the window shutters to muffle the noises of the city below while he examined the ledger fragment under a lamp. He traced a line of ink with a finger and felt another shift. Doubt crept in when he found a marginal note that suggested forgeries could be inserted by a clerk to hide his own debts. He called the initiate on that possibility by motioning for the waxed map fragment. "Initiate," the researcher, when the initiate slipped into the room under cover of night. His hair threaded with ash. "Look at this marginalia." The initiate bent forward until their faces were close. "Initiate, did you plant this?" The researcher bluntly. The initiate's jaw tightened. "No." The initiate shortly. "But others might forge in the margins to shift blame." The researcher watched the initiate's hands. They trembled slightly as he smoothed the ledger's edge. The researcher felt a new emotion. Cautious suspicion recomposed into interrogation. He would need more proof. They planned to move the ledger fragment to a physician's clerk known for honest record keeping, a woman named Scribe Leda. who lived near the river market. They decided to wait until dawn when the city would be distracted. The researcher wrapped the box in cloth and placed the rusted dagger within as a token of their agreement. We go at first light. The initiate, we go together. The researcher nodded and checked his spectacles. He had chosen this path and could not unchoose it. At dawn they crept through side streets toward the river market, keeping to shadows and avoiding the magistrates' patrols. The acolyte met them at a narrow bridge and handed an extra cloak to the researcher. "Acolyte," he said, "you returned." She smiled with a small, secretive expression and replied, "I return when the city needs a stitch in its truth." They moved with a quiet urgency, counting steps and noting patrol patterns. Halfway across the market, they saw the magistrate's herald pinned to a post with a new edict posted above his head ordering a purge of seditious elements. People read the edict and some crossed themselves, others spat. The researcher felt his throat lock and then loosen with determination. He pressed forward with the initiate and acolyte until they reached Scribe Lady's stall, where she received the ledger fragment with a short, incredulous sentence. "This is list and order." She read names and paused when a clerk's signature matched a man who had sat near the magistrate his entire career. Scribe Leda took the ledger and compared its seal with known seals she kept in a small chest. "The wax matches this clerk's pattern," she said, and produced a strip of thin metal the researcher had never seen. She pressed it to the ledger and then to a lamp, revealing hidden indentations. "See." The indent shows the clerk wrote under orders. The researcher's chest tightened and then emptied. This proof pushed his fear into clarity. He felt two emotions collide: relief at verification and fear of the consequences of disclosure. They planned a public reading at the market, where Scribe Leda would read the ledger aloud, and the researcher would distribute copies of the page. The initiate and acolyte worked the crowd, while the researcher prepared copies from the ledger under Leda's lamp. Each copied line was a small act of rebellion. The researcher's hand cramped but did not stop. He heard the sound of boots and turned to see the guard captain and a squad approaching the stall with purposeful strides. The guard captain saw the assembled papers and barked an order. "Seize those documents," he cried. The researcher stepped into the narrow aisle and held up his hands, paper fluttering like a bluff. "Guard captain," he said plainly, "read this first." The guard captain hesitated. The researcher used that hesitation to slide a copy into a young weaver's cloak. The weaver looked at him with wide eyes and nodded. A quick exchange of glances passed between the researcher and the initiate. The guard captain moved closer, and the initiate blocked his path. A short argument erupted. "Step aside," the guard captain ordered. "No, the initiate, you will not take knowledge and call it treason." The exchange became 4 rapid lines. "Magistrate," the guard captain, "read this." The researcher urged, "We will not let you lie." The initiate, "Hands off," the guard captain warned. The argument drew attention and people started to lean in to hear. A sudden shout from the far lane drew the guard captain's attention. The acolyte had set a small bonfire of discarded notices, and people clustered around it. The moment the guard captain turned, Scribe Leda read the first name aloud. It rolled through the market, and a ripple of recognition passed through the stalls. Men in the crowd pointed at neighbors and then at officials. The guard captain spun back, rage in his face, and leapt toward the scribe. The researcher grabbed the ledger and pushed through a narrow opening, dragging the initiate with him. The weaver and several others spread copies through the market. People read and some began to speak the names aloud. The guard captain seized for the initiate, and the initiate struck him in the shoulder with a short movement that sent him staggering. The acolyte used that second to thrust a sealed letter into a guard's hand and whisper, "Read this to the magistrate." The guard read it, and then stood frozen as the letter detailed an order he had carried out himself. The confrontation scattered as market goers formed a ring and demanded explanation. The magistrate's men could not silence every voice. The researcher felt his heart hammer, but also a quiet certitude that the ledger fragment had moved from secret to public. He had turned evidence into instrument. The crowd's focus shifted the balance of power for the moment. As evening fell, the researcher returned to the abandoned scholar's room with a sealed copy of the ledger and a new burden. He catalogued the pages he had removed and labeled them with dates. He placed the rusted dagger into a drawer and closed it with a firm hand. Footsteps sounded distant again. Beyond the window, torches walked a new pattern of patrols. The initiate did not return to the room. His absence created a sharp worry. The researcher opened the shallow box and took out the ledger fragment again, counting the lines. He realized a new emotion had arrived. Heavy responsibility, a decision that would force the next chapter. He set the ledger on the table and wrote a short note to the acolyte with instructions for contacts in another district. A soft knock interrupted him. He opened the door to find a messenger with an official seal who handed a warrant for the initiate's arrest and the order that all copies of the ledger be collected. The researcher read it and felt the inevitability of escalation. He tucked the warrant into his journal and stepped to the window to watch the magistrate's men move through the square. The chapter closed with the researcher pocketing the sealed fragment and the sound of distant boots coming closer, and he chose then to leave the scholar's room, ledger in hand, determined to follow the initiate's trail rather than watch the city burn under silence. The guards crashed into the private study, and the high initiate shoved a smoldering sigil into his palm before the door slammed shut behind them. Suspicion drove the researcher forward from the shadowed rafters. He had watched that same sigil appear earlier when guards smashed through the ruined chamber weeks before. The magistrate barked orders. A guard's metallic gauntlet hit the table. The researcher stayed motionless and counted breath beats, every muscle ready to act. The room smelled of wax and wet leather. The magistrate stood behind his desk, fingers spread over a city map. The scribe set a blank sheet into a metal stand and dipped a pen. The guard captain shoved the initiate to his knees and spat. Named the men. The researcher tightened his grip on the leather, bound journal at his hip. His hand left a faint smear of dry paper dust on the cover. That smear, that small residue, was what kept him from stepping forward too soon. The researcher had been patient for months. He had followed the high initiate from a ruined chamber where guards had already broken ranks and seized a sigil tucked into a stitched pocket. He had watched the initiate nearly taken, and had seen a folded scrap fall from a sleeve, a scrap that tasted like iron, when the researcher later touched it. Now he watched again and felt the old suspicion harden into a plan. He could not risk being discovered. He could not let the magistrate burn every page that proved the city's order relied on ritual anchors. Magistrate, the guard captain sharp, this man stirred sedition. He spoke of anchors and wards and called our peace a fraud. The initiate looked up. His amber eyes did not plead. They registered the room's geometry, the positions of guards and table legs. The researcher watched the initiate's jaw. The initiate's voice was low. I speak names when the council asks me to, he said, not when men with iron fists demand them. The scribe's pen scratched. The researcher heard the sound like a small blade cutting paper. The magistrate leaned forward, voice flat. You will recite what you taught. Initiate. Start with the litany you used in the market to unmake the watchman's certainty. The initiator's shoulders squared. The researcher felt a shift in his chest, a steady motion from suspicion toward certainty. The magistrate believed the right threatened civic order, and he would force a demonstration to prove guilt. The researcher reached inside his robe and palmed the scrap he had taken from the initiate's sleeve weeks prior. Its edges were charred. The first shift had arrived. Doubt settled into determination. The magistrate waved to the guard captain, make him stand. The initiate rose and placed a hand on the table's carved edge. Do it properly. The magistrate, no tricks. The initiate closed his eyes and began a restrained litany. He moved his hands in measured gestures, the same motions the researcher had seen in the ruined chamber. At first the litany stayed superficial. The guards relaxed marginally. Then the initiate altered a breath and let a word slip with a different tone. A copper taste rose in the researcher's mouth. The second emotion shift arrived. The researcher's calm focus buckled into tightened alarm. A pale halo of smoke gathered above the initiate's palms. The scribe leaned back, eyes widening. The guard captain barked, "Stop him!" The magistrate's knuckles whitened on the desk. The initiate's voice hardened into a practiced cadence, and something in the map on the desk pulsed faintly beneath the varnish. The researcher stepped forward when a guard pivoted to block his path, a deliberate motion that made his presence register as a shadow at the edge of the room. "Stand away." The guard captain ordered, back to the wall. The researcher moved behind a hanging tapestry and lifted the scrap into the light. The charred ink showed a lattice drawn in tight, repeated spirals. The researcher traced the lines with the tip of a finger and felt a small vibration under his nail. He coughed once to clear his throat and used the sound as a pretext to shift his position. He was careful. Every motion counted. The researcher needed to get a single page from the magistrate's table without triggering detection. The scribe read aloud from his transcript, voice steady to hide his fear. "He says the wards are not divine, but constructed to bind the city." The magistrate's face turned red. "Do you deny the council's work?" He snapped. "Do you accuse us of using rites to shape obedience?" The initiate answered in a single line, "I accuse no one of malice. I say the crown holds a mechanism. Remove it, and the certainty unravels." The researcher heard the word mechanism and mapped it onto the scrap's spirals. The magistrate moved to the map and slammed a fist down. "Proof, then!" "Prove it now." He pointed at a carving on the table. A small brass crown inset into wood. "Recite the line that touches the crown." The initiate hesitated, eyes flicking to the researcher. The researcher felt the second shift deepen. Vigilance flowed into a deliberate decision to intervene. He would not be the man who watched others die for knowledge. He would act. The initiate inhaled and began a cadence that trembled at the edges. He changed a vowel on the third phrase, and the brass crown on the table shivered. A thin ash rose along the map's creases, and a faint overlay of sigils ghosted across the city's grid. The guards sucked air through their teeth. The magistrate's face collapsed into something like anger and calculation. The researcher lunged when the guard captain moved to strike the initiate. He snagged the hem of the banner and pulled a corner, creating a tiny air gust that lifted a loose page from the table toward him. He caught the page with his free hand and hit it against his chest. Its ink showed anchor points arrayed under marketplaces and watchtowers. The researcher skimmed lines with urgent eyes. The page named reliquaries in the civic archive and listed a ceremonial crown as an anchor for a central ward. He felt a fresh shift. Alarm settled into grim clarity. The magistrate was not only punishing sedition. He was protecting a system that used ritual objects to bind the city's obedience. The magistrate barked, "Secure him." Two guards grabbed the initiate's arms. The initiate thrust an elbow and twisted out of one hold. "Magistrate, you will not." "Guard captain, enough talk." The researcher saw the initiate's hand move toward a hidden pocket. He had seen that pocket before in the ruined chamber, and he knew the initiate's habit of tucking sigils into stitched fabric. The researcher remembered the earlier seizure. When guards crashed into the chamber, the high initiate shoved a smoldering sigil into a stitched pocket before he could be seized. That memory was concrete. It dictated his next move. When the initiate pulled a folded scrap out and slapped it onto the desk, the magistrate's expression changed. "What is that?" the magistrate demanded. The initiate opened his palm and spread a torn page in front of the room. The torn edges matched the one the researcher had taken weeks earlier. The scribe's pen stopped. The researcher leaned out from the tapestry and mouthed a single assessment to himself. The initiate had supplied evidence deliberately to force exposure rather than allow secret destruction. The archivist in the magistrate's retinue, a low-ranking clerk who had come with the scribe, stepped forward and said, "Those are registry marks. They show reliquary locations." The magistrate snatched the page. He read the list aloud, naming the civic archive and 3 reliquaries. He cited laws. He cited the council as past blessings. "This is treachery," he said, voice narrowing. "You will be tried for sedition. You will explain how you unmake our wards." The initiate looked at the researcher and said, "Quietly, tell them what you saw in the rubble." The researcher did not answer aloud. He could not yet risk revealing how close he had been in the ruined chamber. Instead, he adjusted the journal to reveal a binding corner, with the compendium's crest exposed. A sudden knock at the study door made all heads turn. A page from the magistrate's corridor announced a visitor with urgent business. An external event intruded. A messenger with news from the gates. The magistrate barked, then softened. A civic matter required immediate attention. He barked a new order. "Bring them both to the hall at first light." No escape. The guards tightened their grips. The initiate's breathing became a tool the researcher tracked, counting inhalations and interim pauses. The researcher observed a small, practical sign of emotion. The initiate's fingers trailed over the cloth armband, bearing a spiral sigil. When the magistrate stepped away to sign summonses, the researcher acted. He slid from the tapestry and crossed toward the desk, while the scribe catalogued the magistrate's notes. He palmed the page he had taken and pressed it inside his robe. He needed the compendium the magistrate had placed under the brass crown. He needed to see the reliquary's seal. He moved with the slow economy of someone who had practiced stealth through endless stacks of dusty books. The magistrate returned and noticed a missing ribbon on his map stand. He glared. Who moved that? He reached under the crown and felt the empty space where a folded bundle of rights usually rested. The guard captain cursed and turned. The room contracted into motion. Guards blocked exits. The researcher felt the net tighten. He ducked behind the study curtain and slipped a page from beneath his robe into the lining of his journal, as if tucking a note into an inner wrapper. He could not carry the whole compendium. He would take what he could and go. The magistrate pointed to the initiate. "You are the cause." The initiate laughed a single bitter sound. "No, magistrate. You are the cause when you cling to a crown that binds citizens and calls it peace." The magistrate's face went hard. He ordered a demonstration of public humiliation. The guard captain objected. "We should hold him and drag him to the plaza." The magistrate ignored the objection and instead leaned forward to press a question that would force the initiate to act. He wanted spectacle. The initiate's fingers clenched. The researcher read the silvery tension in those knuckles and felt a new surge of resolve. He would not allow the crown to remain intact. At night, the city watch would be thinner. The researcher calculated risk by the soft scrape of boots in the corridor. He signaled to a fellow initiate who had waited in a shadowed niche. The fellow initiate nodded and moved toward the archive keys on the magistrate's belt. The researcher worked with concrete efficiency. The fellow initiate slipped a dagger under the belt strap, freed the keys, and palmed them into the initiate's hand. The external event came. Someone in the hallway coughed, and the sound cut through the room like a small bell. The guard nearest the door moved to check and left the study with 2 others. The initiate saw the opening and went for the keys. He pushed past the guard captain and dashed for the archive door. "Stop him!" the guard captain shouted. The researcher stepped from behind the table and met the captain's shoulder with his chest, a blunt physical contact that bought the initiate 2 heartbeats. The initiate ran down the servant stair while the scribe tried to keep count of the chaos. The researcher followed, guided by the smell of old vellum and damp stone, by the exact echo of boots on flagstones. They moved through servant corridors that smelled of boiling stew and wet wool. A soldier swung at the initiate. The initiate ducked and barreled through a narrow passage into a service stair. The researcher heard the scrape of a metal gauntlet and felt a fist press into his ribs. He did not shout, he kept moving. He pushed open a low hatch and found a flight of stone steps that led to the vaulted civic archive. The archive smelled of dust, iron, and old glue. The researcher and the initiate slipped between stacks and headed for a sealed reliquary at the room's far end. The initiate fumbled with the keys, moved faster. The guard captain called over the claimer of pursuing boots. "Don't grant them air." The initiate's hands shook. The researcher saw the shaking as a physical response to fear. The initiate pressed his tongue to his lower lip and forced his hand steady. They reached the reliquary and forced a heavy lid. The initiate thrust his shoulder into it and an object rolled free. A ceremonial crown veneered in burnished brass with a carved underside that matched the map's anchor. The initiate grabbed the crown and lifted it, eyes wild. The guard captain and 2 guards poured into the archive and the magistrate followed, voice high with command. "Drop it!" he yelled. The initiate lunged for the reliquary and shoved the crown onto the floor. The researcher moved to block a guard's strike and instead felt the crown's weight fall into his hands when the initiate shoved it toward him. The reliquary moment became the chapter's peak. The initiate struck the crown with the butt of his dagger. The metal split with a brittle sound. Ash streaked across the floor. A web of fine sigils peeled from the crown's interior like brittle skin and floated outward in a spiral. The magistrate staggered and reached for the table, voice breaking. "What have you done?" The guard captain lunged to restrain the initiate. The researcher shoved a guard aside with both arms and snatched a bound compendium that had been tucked near the reliquary. The guards and the magistrate fanned out to seize them. The scribe shouted, "Bind them." The guard captain barked at the researcher, "Drop the book." The researcher held it close. The pages were heavy with ritual diagrams and civic ordinances written over each other. The initiate tripped as 2 guards closed in and fell, scattering pages that fluttered like small, black leaves over the stone floor. The researcher shoved the book under his arm and shoved the initiate toward a narrow passage. 3 rapid exchanges followed as the guards closed in. "Let go," the guard captain hissed. "No." The researcher, voice low, "Hand it over," the magistrate ordered. "Never," the initiate snarled. The guards moved in faster. There were 3 quick strikes, the metallic flash of gauntlets, the thud of bodies. The researcher heard the sound of the crown's shattered fragments skittering. 1 shard embedded into the guard's boot and sprayed a fine ashy dust. A faint ripple moved across the archive floor where the sigils touched the stone. A protective ward flared and then splintered. The researcher felt the residual shock under his palm as if the archive had exhaled. The magistrate tried to reassert control by grabbing the initiate's collar. The initiate bit down on a guard's forearm and the guard howled. The researcher dragged the initiate through a narrow service tunnel that led deeper beneath the archive. The tunnel smelled of iron and old resin. A guard's footfall thudded behind them like measured percussion. They slipped through a hidden egress into service tunnels beneath the city, while alarms began their slow toll above. The city above reeled from a brief, inexplicable disturbance. Bells chimed and a patrol's horn sounded in the distance. The researcher used the compendium's binding as a wedge to pry open a rusted grate. The fellow initiate shoved them through and closed it with a ragged breath. The researcher felt the compendium's cover against his ribs and knew the pages inside would change what people called order. In the ruined chapel outside the city, the trio sat under a fractured arch. Dawn light cut the dusty air into thin columns. The initiate unwrapped a cloth to reveal a scorched sigil and set it on the compendium's open page. The researcher ran a fingertip across the ink and felt the thrum of anchor points like a weak pulse. The fellow initiate offered water. "Drink," she said. "We will need clarity." The initiate sipped. He chewed the inside of his cheek and said, "They will hunt us. The researcher nodded and closed the compendium with deliberate force. They reviewed the stolen pages. The researcher read aloud selective lines to avoid provoking panic. The crown anchors a lattice beneath markets, watch towers, and the magistrate's steps, he said. Remove the crown and the lattice unwaves confidence in civic forms. The initiate tapped the page with a finger scarred along the jawline. We did not destroy to sow chaos, he said. We broke a device that coerced obedience. The fellow initiate tightened her grip on a cloth band and breathed once, slow. A messenger's hoofbeats sounded in the distance. The researcher looked up when a bell tolled the magistrate's summons. He felt the chapter's final shift, from daring into resolve tempered by risk. He closed the compendium and tucked the scorched sigil into an inner fold. We will be fugitives now, the researcher plainly. The initiate's jaw set. Then we keep moving, the initiate replied. The researcher slid a page into the journal's inner pocket and zipped the leather cover closed. He tested the strap on his shoulder and found the weight of the compendium steady. The fellow initiate checked the path back towards sympathetic allies. The initiate unfastened his armband and handed it to the researcher. Keep it, he said. As proof, the researcher accepted it. He pressed the spiral sigil into the palm of his hand and felt the grain of the weave. As daylight broadened, the ruined chapel's arch threw a sharp shadow across the compendium. The researcher looked toward the road back to the city. He could hear the distant clamor of councillors and the faint, ordered conversations of magistrates beginning their day. He tightened his grip on the stolen pages and stood. The initiate gathered the remaining loose pages and stacked them inside a patchwork satchel. The fellow initiate pocketed a small iron tool that could pick a council lock. The researcher led them down a path lined with collapsed stone. He did not speak about future plans. He measured the steps. Birds called. A dog barked in the distance. The sound of distant boots grew steadier, then faded as they moved away from the city. He felt the immediate shape of the chapter resolve. A reliquary smashed, a scorched sigil in hand, a compendium smuggled away. Yet consequences loomed. The magistrate would not let a shattered crown pass without retribution. A courier's shadow crested the far slope. The researcher stopped them. Not now, he said. We leave by noon. The initiate nodded. The fellow initiate folded a strip of cloth over the compendium and tied it closed. The researcher glanced back once at the town, its towers neat against the sky, and felt no nostalgia. He felt instead the concrete pressure of being hunted. The chapter ended with a concrete beat. The researcher hearing a distant council bell, and choosing to move toward allies, the compendium heavy at his side. They left the ruined chapel in a line and stepped into the pre-dawn road. The researcher cradled the compendium and watched the initiate walk ahead with measured, ritual steps that had once been used to unmake the city's certainty. He did not make promises aloud. He adjusted his spectacles, checked the journal strap, and matched his pace to the fellow initiates. The bells in the far city rang again, and the sound chased them down the valley. The high initiate vaulted onto the coronation dais and pressed a smoldering sigil into the magistrate's crown. Suspicion drove the occult researcher forward from the crowd. He had seen that same sigil before when guards tore through the ruined chamber and the initiate had shoved a cut of burning ash into a stitched pocket. Men shouted. A guard lunged. The magistrate barked, "Seize him!" The high initiate did not flinch. He bent, planted the sigil, and let the ash smoke rise across the crown's gold. The opening seconds collapsed into raw choices. The researcher moved without hesitating. He had spent months tracing marks in stone and ink, sitting beneath the archivist's lamp until the edges of pages blurred. Now, suspicion was not idle thought. It was a tool. He wedged his way between a merchant's cloak and a marble plinth, and reached for the scrap that the initiate had secreted in his sleeve. He closed his hand on hot paper and tasted iron on his tongue. Doubt tightened his jaw. He could not yet know whether exposing the crown would free people or merely replace one caution with another. Crowd noise swelled. The magistrate shouted again, "Bring him forward," he ordered, voice thin with the suddenness of being interrupted. The captain of guards surged across the dais. The researcher recognized the captain's pattern, a soldier trained to close space quickly, to trap a body between shield and wall. The researcher stepped back and let the crowd push him. He watched the initiate's hands. The initiate's left hand carried a cloth armband with the spiral sigil. He did not strike. He held his face calm. A woman next to the researcher screamed and then fell silent, covering her mouth with both palms. The problem at stake established itself without rhetoric. The crown was more than ornament. The scrap of scorched vellum in the researcher's palm had a half diagram and a thin line of notation that mapped to civic pylons and market posts. It named a rhythm. The crowd pressed in on the plaza's marble steps and watched as the captain reached the initiate and yanked him down from the dais. A watcher on the magistrate's bench whispered, "He ruined the ritual." The researcher did not answer. He slid behind a pillar and rid the scrap by the sun. Magistrate, the captain, hauling the initiate toward the escort corridor. He defiles public ceremony. He will hang for this. The captain's voice carried an animal certainty. The researcher felt a second shift. Anger flared at the captain's ease in naming punishment. He had seen guards break into the ruined chamber months prior, helmets clattering, and the initiate had shoved a smoldering mark into his stitched pocket to hide it. That same action repeated now in daylight altered how the researcher passed intent. The initiate's sabotage could not be mere vandalism. In the lanes off the civic square the scrimmage became physical. The captain threw the initiate beneath a rank of shields. Soldiers shoved citizens aside. The initiate did not kick or bite. He struck precise palm patterns on his vestments, and then covered his mouth with a kerchief. The researcher moved with the press of bodies and managed to scoop a scorched scrap from the pavement. He slid the scrap into his journal and tucked the journal inside his coat. "Give him the law," a man behind him muttered. The researcher kept walking. They brought the initiate into the magistrate's holding wing. Heavy doors clanged shut. Torches hissed. The captain paced like a caged predator. The magistrate planted himself at the head of the antechamber, cloak folded perfectly, face reddening as if embarrassed by his crown. "Speak, initiate." The magistrate. "Who taught you this desecration?" The initiate lifted his chin. He did not name allies, he made ritual hand gestures instead. His fingers braided and then opened in a small, metrical pattern the captain could not read. The researcher offered a bargain. "I can translate the fragment," he said, voice low. "I will do it in exchange for access to the archive's ledger for 1 hour." The captain barked a laugh. "And why should we trust a scholar?" The researcher did not answer with an argument. He removed the scorched scrap and set it on the wooden table between them. The ash left a black smear across the grain. The captain leaned forward, eyes flat. The magistrate touched the crown beneath his arm and then set it down as if to feel its weight. The bargain altered the tone. The magistrate grudgingly agreed. The researcher felt unease at the trade. He had suspected the city of weaponized ceremony. Now he was offering his knowledge to see the mechanism. If he revealed too much, he might hand officials the tools to make the system more efficient. If he revealed too little, the magistrate could crush the initiate and keep the apparatus intact. He set his hand over the scrap and felt a tremor of choice. He swallowed, and that physical gulp became his decision. In the archive's vaulted room, the city scribe produced a sealed ledger from a high shelf. The leather was soft with repeated handling. The clasp had a dent. The scribe's hands trembled when he placed the ledger on the table. "This should not be seen by many," he said. "It maps sigils embedded into posts, gates, even water channels." The researcher read the first page and then the second. The ledger contained diagrams that matched the scrap. Each public fixture had a mark. The crown's diagram centered on the dais and included ritual timings and market schedules. The scribe closed the ledger and spoke in a voice that lacked the old certainty of inked records. We built it because we thought the city needed order. The magistrate wanted compliance. We provided patterns for compliance. He stared at the researcher. I signed this. I wrote those columns. The researcher watched the scribe's fingers curl. The scribe was a secondary figure who had altered the direction of the story. He had given the initiate new leverage. City scribe, the magistrate, explain yourself. The scribe did not offer excuses. He pushed the ledger toward the magistrate and then toward the captain. He named dates, recorded rounds, and mapped who had ordered each insertion. The captain's jaw dropped. He spat a curse. The magistrate's face pinched with a new expression that was neither fury nor shame, but something the researcher had not seen on him yet. Exposure. That exposure changed options. The magistrate had called the city to order a trial to reassert control, but now the ledger reframed the trial into an institutional confession. The High Initiate, when he heard the ledger's existence through the council, proposed a demonstration during the hearing. He requested permission to enact a ritual that would reveal the crown's hidden patterns to every citizen. He framed it as a public demonstration rather than a spectacle. The magistrate hesitated. He measured the risk of letting the crowd see the mechanism. The captain leaned toward the magistrate and said, "If you allow it, magistrate, they'll riot." The magistrate's mouth tightened. The researcher felt a third emotional shift. A cold calculation replaced his earlier doubt. He had begun the day suspicious. Now he placed his hands on the ledger and chose to translate the critical passage. He read aloud short lines while the captain and magistrate listened in sharp silence. The initiate sat with his wrists bound but his eyes steady. The researcher, the crown does not command hearts. It feeds cadence. Mark its close, priests chant, soldiers march. These marks tune the city's motions until people move without thinking. He paused. It is an engineered habit, magistrate. The magistrate's hand clamped the edge of the table. We will have a public hearing at dusk, the magistrate announced. He tried to reclaim the framing. We will show the law. We will demonstrate justice. The initiate smiled without moving his mouth. The scribe paled. The captain spat and left the room with a tight swing of his cloak. The researcher remained and wrote down each name the scribe had offered. He marked pages with a small cross that meant explain further later. On the evening of the court summons, the grand civic hall filled with citizens. Torches burned in iron rings. The dais sat at the center with chairs for magistrates, benches for petitioners, and galleries for the families of those who served. People crowded the aisles and pressed against railings. The researcher took a low seat at the edge of gallery shadow and opened his journal. He had translated the ledger's essential line. The crown sigils were keyed to daily rituals that shaped compliance. He had chosen which passages to read aloud and which to seal. The High Initiate stood before the dais. He spoke a short, metered litany and then produced a small bowl with ash. Magistrate, he said, voice even. Show them. The magistrate gavelled and said, proceed. The researcher watched the captain's hand twitch toward his sword. The initiate began the destabilizing rite. He placed the bowl on the dais and traced a spiral with his fingertip into the ash. The spiral matched the armband sigil. The city's engraved charts inlaid into the dais gleamed as the ash scraped them. Lines along the crown's inner rim started to warm under the ash. A cold blue light rose from the sigil grooves and spread across civic charts mounted behind the magistrate like a map. The effect was immediate. A low hum that threaded through benches, and then a higher resonance that pressed at the teeth. Some citizens covered their ears. Others leaned forward, eyes fixed. The magistrate barked an order. Stop that. His voice snapped. The captain gave the signal and soldiers surged. The initiate did not resist with force. He kept chanting. He lifted his hands in specific gestures that soldered the city's patterns into view. Lines of light projected across civic charts, showing how markets, water gates, and bell schedules aligned with the crown's marks. Citizens began to murmur. The captain shouted again, and a soldier shoved an old woman backward. She hit the marble and then rose, staring at the dais where maps now pulsed with the system she had never noticed. The researcher moved forward when a guard lunged at the initiate's wrist. He blocked the guard with a flat palm on the soldier's forearm. "Captain," he said, voice low, "this is evidence. Do not destroy it." The guard grimaced. Occult researcher, "Step back." The researcher did not step back. He pulled a folded scrap from his coat and flattened it on the dais so that the projected lines matched the diagram. He pointed to a market post 2 blocks over there. The mark daily triggers market bell 6. The bell times the baker's deliveries. The bell builds expectation. The crown feeds on those expectations. The captain's expression faltered. The ritual reached a new intensity. The crown's inner grooves flared, casting thin streaks across the magistrate's hands. A woman in the gallery stood up and shouted, "You used my labor to make them obey us." Citizens cried out, voices colliding. The captain lunged for the initiate again. Now the magistrate's commands broke into uncertain phrases. He ordered restraint, then retracted, then demanded trial proceedings resume. His voice lost the firm cadence that had governed the city's rituals. The confrontation escalated into blows. The captain attempted to drag the initiate to the floor, and a splinter of the bench fractured under the scuffle. Guards and citizens collided in the aisles. The researcher moved between a pair of pressed fists and a child's head, swatting a raised pole aside. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the city scribe. "Take the ledger," the scribe hissed. He thrust the sealed book into the researcher's hands. "You know what to do with it." The researcher's fingers closed over the leather. He felt the weight of the city's record and of choice. One soldier fell, clutching his side where an iron hit had landed. Another guard's gauntlet slipped and crashed against the dais. The crown buckled and a crack spidered across its filigree. The magistrate's composure shattered with the crown. He rose, hand on the cracked rim, and then, for the first time all night, he looked at the crowd and failed to find authority there. Some people fled. Others gathered in a ring around the dais. They touched the projected charts with bare fingers, tracing routes that had guided their commerce for years. After the rupture, the city did not snap back. The captain tried to reassemble his men. He barked orders, but his voice faltered as a baker shouted, "Why did you hide this?" The captain's shoulders sagged. He removed his helmet and shoved it under his arm as if to feel more human. He spoke less in commands and more in questions. "What now?" He asked no one in particular. The researcher saw the captain's hands, marked by old colaces, and knew the man would not find easy answers. That night the magistrate withdrew his resignation and took no action for a long hour. He sat at his desk with his crown in pieces on velvet and the scribe at his elbow. The scribe read aloud the ledger's entries and named the officials who had signed off on each installation. The magistrate passed his fingers over the crack in the crown and finally said, "We must dismantle the marks. We must rewrite how the city coordinates itself." The researcher heard both remorse and calculation. The scribe nodded. The captain stood in the doorway and then turned his back. The high initiate moved through the courtyard with 2 attendants and a small satchel. He had not spoken much since the hearing, but his eyes scanned faces and ledger covers like a man who catalogued risk. He approached the researcher near the steps and set a hand on his arm. His voice was soft. You could have handed the ledger to the magistrate and watched him bury it again. He said, "Why did you not?" The researcher folded the sealed book beneath his coat and answered, "Because the ledger is both weapon and key. It must not be wielded by those who will use it for quiet enforcement. It must be made public in a way that the city can confront it and choose." The initiate looked at him for a long breath and then nodded once, a small, ritual tilt. They gave the city a choice. The council convened an emergency session and ordered that the ledger be read at the market square within 3 days. But in the meantime, the researcher and the scribe walked from Clerk House to Guild Hall and read select passages aloud for merchants, bakers, and the bell ringers who had unwittingly participated. They read concrete entries, where marks had been placed, what times they triggered, and which officials had authorized them. They read the dates in specific months so that everyone listening could place the events in their own calendars. Those audiences murmured, argued, and then demanded that the marks be exposed and unmade. The captain, confronted by his men and by frightened citizens, ordered a rotation and then stepped down from command the next morning. He removed the stripes from his breast and left them on the magistrate's table. He did not speak of loyalty. He simply told a clerk, "I will not enforce a system I cannot explain to my men." The scribe handed the sealed ledger to a small committee of elected traders and guild elders with instructions to consult the researcher before acting. The magistrate, chastened, led a public demolition of some marked posts 2 weeks later. They pulled iron stakes from the ground and chiseled the sigils from stone. The researcher supervised the work and noted down each removal in his journal. The high initiate did not remain for the city's slow and messy reforms. He left at dawn with his 2 attendants and a satchel of inks. Before he stepped into the alley that led away from the council house, he folded a small strip of paper and placed it into the researcher's hand. "The work continues," he said. "The system will find new shapes if we are not vigilant." The researcher looked at the strip and read a single line, a coordinate and a date. The initiate nodded and then vanished into the rain-slicked stones. The researcher turned back to his study and laid the ledger on his table. He set the leather, opened pages against the lamp's halo, and read each entry again. He checked the scribe's notes and cross-referenced names. He made decisions about what to publish, what to redact, and what to seal. He wrote in short lines, refusing long sentences. He wrote the names he owed to the public record, and those he would protect, to prevent the marks from being reassembled into a weapon. He chose to keep 1 copy sealed in his journal's inner binding and to hand the official ledger to the city's committee for dismantling. He did not trust power, but he trusted that public eyes would force action. Days later, the market square filled as promised. The scribe read the ledger in plain voice. People traced rotes on the boards laid out at the foot of the dais. A mason hammered at a marked pillar and removed the carved sigil. Dust fell in a precise arc, and a child sneezed. The magistrate stood to one side, crown in pieces at his feet, hands covered with mortar from the chisel. The captain watched the crowd and then left the square. The high initiate's name appeared in rumor but not in presence. The researcher sat in the gallery and felt a weary relief that had weight in his shoulders and a hollow in his mouth. The final decision belonged to the city. They voted to require public review before any symbolic element could be embedded into civic infrastructure. They set a council to oversee ritual inscriptions and to publish copies of permissions. The magistrate was not executed or exiled. His office ceded some powers and accepted new scrutiny. The captain resigned and found work training recruits with a new emphasis on explanation and law. The high initiate continued his travels. The researcher closed 1 chapter of his work on the city's mechanism and opened another in his ledger. He had wanted to reveal hidden systems. He had done so and seen both the good and the harm that followed. At pre-dawn, in the back room of his study, the researcher transcribed the final sigils he had removed from the crown into a page that he would seal. He wrote short, clear lines, coordinates, glyphs, and the exact mechanical effects observed at each site. He folded the pages, tied them with a strip of thread, and pressed warm wax over the knot. He stamped the wax with his signet and listened to the small clack of metal on the seal. The high initiate's satchel had left a faint smell of resin in the air. The researcher slid the sealed packet into the inner pocket of his journal and then placed the journal under the table. He heard footsteps in the corridor, slow and sure. Someone knocked once, measured and deliberate. The researcher set his pen down, smoothed his robe, and left the desk. He opened the backroom door. A messenger waited, rein on his shoulders, with a small parcel and a map. The researcher took the parcel and the map, rolled the map under his arm, and stepped outside into a trim dawn where the city's bells were not yet ringing in their old, enforced cadence. He walked toward the square and toward a council that now needed to decide how to keep order without secret marks. He walked with the ledger sealed, and the knowledge that exposing a system had altered the city in ways he could not fully control. On the dais, a guard slammed his gauntlet down, and the crown's largest shard split into 3 pieces. The sound carried across the square. Citizens looked up and some clapped, others cried. The researcher put his hand into his coat and touched the warm wax beneath the journal's cover, feeling the imprint of his signet. He did not speak about fate or destiny. He only felt a tightening in his chest and a steadying of his hands. He had done what he set out to do. He had turned a hidden mechanism into a choice. He walked into the square and handed the committee a sealed copy of the ledger with instructions to publish and to remove the remaining marks. The committee accepted it with trembling hands and then began to argue about procedure. The researcher listened until he could no longer stand the small, repetitive debates of implementation. He stepped away. When he reached his study again, he opened the inner pocket and took out the strip the High Initiate had given him. He read the coordinate and the date once more. He folded the strip and placed it into his journal beside the sealed packet. He blew on the wax and watched a few flakes of ash lift from the table into the light. The city had chosen. The crown lay broken on the dais. The High Initiate had walked into the rain. The captain had laid down his stripes. The magistrate sat with mortar on his hands. The researcher closed the ledger, pressed warm wax over the braid of pages, and set the sealed book beneath the study table as a single, deliberate knock sounded at the door.